The calendar tells you he was there on January 11. The footage confirms it. And the critical question for this investigation is not whether he planned this crime, because the planning is no longer in doubt. The question is what he left behind along the route he used to disappear. This is a true crime analysis of the Nancy Guthrie case at the point where the investigation has moved from searching for a person into mapping a timeline. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She has been missing from the Tucson, Arizona area since late January 2026. Her health is fragile. She requires medication. Her family has described every passing day as agony. The community around her home is afraid. And the investigation, now under active federal review, has accumulated enough evidence across nearly 3 months to begin seeing a shape in what was previously fragments. The shape that is emerging is one of premeditation, extended, patient, deliberate premeditation. The masked individual caught on camera at her front door on January 11 was not making a first visit. Analysts reviewing the case believe he had been to that neighborhood before. He was learning the property. He was learning the resident. He was learning the rhythms of a household belonging to an elderly woman who walked with a walker and depended on others for transportation. He was building operational knowledge that he would use on January 30 when he arrived with a weapon, a backpack, and a plan he had been developing for weeks. This report takes that structure of premeditation and traces it forward through the evidence that exists, the vehicles involved that night, the cameras positioned along the escape route, the way investigators read surveillance patterns across multiple prior visits, and the specific forensic meaning of evidence recovered inside the home. Every piece connects. The work is in the connecting. True crime analysis at this level is not about generating emotion. It is about generating clarity. And in the Nancy Guthrie case, clarity is what the investigation has been working toward for 3 months. Tonight, it is getting closer. Understanding the suspect's behavior pattern across multiple visits before January 30 is the foundation for understanding everything else in this investigation. When investigators describe a suspect as having conducted surveillance prior to a crime, they are identifying a specific behavioral profile. Pre-crime surveillance is not impulsive. It is not reactive. It belongs to individuals who have decided in advance that they are going to act, who need operational information before they can act safely, and who are willing to invest time in acquiring that information before they commit. The patience involved, the willingness to return to a location multiple times without acting, is itself a data point about the type of person investigators are looking for. The footage from January 11 places a masked individual at Nancy Guthrie's front door. He did not force entry. He did not act. He appeared, observed, and left. In the analytical framework of pre-crime surveillance, this visit serves specific functions. It confirms that the camera on the front porch was positioned in a way that would capture someone at the door. It allows him to observe whether the home's occupant appears at the door in response to his presence and how quickly. It gives him visual confirmation of the property's geography, the front approach, the sight lines from neighboring properties, the lighting conditions at night. On the days investigators believe he returned between January 11 and January 30, the same process was at work, building familiarity, tracking the routine, identifying the window of vulnerability that would give him the operational conditions he needed. What changed on January 30 was the equipment he brought. On earlier visits, he carried nothing visible that indicated operational readiness. On January 30, he had a weapon and a backpack. The backpack is particularly significant in the analytical framework. A backpack in this context implies preparation for a duration, items needed after the act, restraints or materials for controlling a victim, tools for specific tasks, or supplies for the period following the crime. The transition from empty hands to a loaded backpack is the physical expression of a decision that had been building across weeks of surveillance. The Uber driver who transported Nancy Guthrie that night is now a critical witness and a critical source of potential evidence. Consider the geometry of the situation. She was picked up at one location and transported to Annie Guthrie's home. She stayed. She was then brought home by her son-in-law. The suspect was in the neighborhood when she returned. He knew she was coming because he had watched the routine long enough to know that she would come home and that at a certain hour, the lights would go out. The Uber vehicle carrying Nancy Guthrie that night was moving through the same geographic area where the suspect was operating. If that vehicle had a forward-facing camera, it may have captured vehicles parked along the road or near the home that do not belong to the neighborhood. A vehicle seen in an unusual location at an unusual hour, captured by an Uber camera in transit, is exactly the kind of peripheral footage that has cracked cases that investigators thought were stuck. The direction of travel, the timestamp, the location, combined with other evidence about where the suspect's vehicle was stationed. This is how investigation builds timelines that eventually point to individuals. The navigational data from the Uber vehicle, its GPS record, its trip data from the rideshare company, its precise pickup and drop-off times. All of this establishes the exact window during which the suspect was lying in wait. That window, defined precisely, is the filter through which all other footage from all other cameras in the area can be analyzed. Every camera in the geographic zone around Nancy Guthrie's home that recorded during that specific window is a potential source of the evidence that is still missing from this case. The route map Annie Guthrie provided to her neighbors is analytically one of the most undervalued contributions to this investigation. In true crime analysis, the input of family members who know the geography is frequently treated by law enforcement with skepticism that is not warranted by the history of how cases are actually solved. Family members of missing persons often provide the most accurate descriptions of what should be investigated because they know what investigators cannot quickly learn: the neighborhood, the roads, the cameras, the rhythms. Annie Guthrie has lived near her mother. She knows where Nancy Guthrie goes, how she gets there, and which routes connect the relevant locations in the most direct and least surveilled ways. The map she shared with her community identified a specific corridor. That corridor passes through a sequence of locations that, analyzed individually for their camera coverage, create a network of potential evidence points that the investigation cannot afford to leave unexamined. Consider the elementary school. A school building positioned near a thoroughfare maintains a camera system whose primary purpose is to document who approaches the building and who passes along adjacent roads during school hours. But school cameras do not stop recording at the end of the school day. They continue through the night. And the field of view from cameras mounted at multiple corners of a school building does not simply cover the building itself. It extends outward to the adjacent sidewalk and road. Multiple cameras on the same building will have overlapping fields of view, meaning that a vehicle traveling along the road at the front of the school will be captured by more than one camera simultaneously. A license plate visible from one angle may not be visible from another, but the combined footage from multiple cameras at a single location can produce a composite identification. Consider the nail salon with an exterior camera positioned toward the parking lot and the road. Nail salons operate during daytime hours, but exterior security cameras run continuously. The footage from such a camera at 2 or 3 in the morning, when traffic is minimal, is especially valuable because every vehicle present is exceptional. In a neighborhood during normal waking hours, a vehicle parked along the road is unremarkable. At 2 in the morning, a vehicle parked along the road is something an investigator wants to know about. Consider the intersection points where traffic must slow or stop. A vehicle fleeing with a kidnapping victim is not going to run a red light at a major intersection in a residential area at 2 in the morning. The driver is trying not to attract attention. He is going to stop or slow at every intersection where doing otherwise would risk a police encounter. Those stops and slowdowns are exactly the moments when surveillance cameras capture the most useful footage. A vehicle at rest or near rest can be photographed. A license plate illuminated by a traffic signal can be read. A driver's profile, even partially obscured, can be recorded. The fact that no footage from this corridor has been publicly confirmed as decisive does not mean it does not exist. It means either that investigators are protecting it as active evidence in an ongoing investigation, or that the specific cameras along the route were not recording, had already overwritten their footage by the time investigators reached them, or that the suspect chose a path that avoided those specific points. Given the level of planning visible in the suspect's prior behavior, the third possibility is worth taking seriously. He knew the neighborhood. He may have known the camera locations. He may have chosen a route precisely because it avoided the cameras he was aware of. But there is a limit to what any human can know about the camera infrastructure of an area he has observed on foot or by vehicle from the outside. Private security cameras, residential doorbell cameras, cameras on vehicles parked in driveways, cameras at businesses that are not obviously surveillance-oriented. These are the sources of evidence that a surveilling suspect cannot fully anticipate. And they are the sources that investigators working through hundreds of hours of footage are still searching. Subscribe now to follow this investigation as these evidential threads are resolved. Every week brings new developments, and the next one may be the one that finally answers the question this case has been asking since late January. The vehicle evidence in this case is the dimension that has not yet been fully explored publicly, and it may be the dimension that resolves it. Modern vehicles generate data at a level that most drivers do not fully appreciate. Beyond what drivers deliberately record through dash cams, the vehicle itself records. The internal computer system tracks when the engine starts and stops. It records door events, which door opened, when, for how long. It records speed, acceleration, and braking. In vehicles with navigation systems, it records routes taken and destinations entered. In some vehicles, it records who is connected to the vehicle's Bluetooth system and when. In vehicles with built-in cameras, it records what those cameras see. The vehicle Annie Guthrie's husband drove that evening was impounded at a point in the investigation. Impoundment of a vehicle is a standard investigative step when the vehicle may contain evidence. It allows investigators to process the vehicle for physical trace evidence, to examine its camera systems, if any exist, and to extract the data from its internal recording systems. The fact that the vehicle was impounded means investigators had it in their possession. Whether all of the data it contained was fully extracted and analyzed, and what that analysis produced, is not publicly confirmed. What experienced investigators note about vehicle data analysis is that it is thorough and it is objective. A vehicle's internal computer does not have loyalty to the person driving it. It records what happened, not what the driver would prefer to have happened. If the vehicle moved after a certain hour, the computer knows it. If the vehicle traveled a specific route, the navigation history records it. If a door was opened at a specific time, the event log shows it. This data is the equivalent of a witness who is present for everything, cannot be intimidated, and cannot be persuaded to change their account. The Uber vehicle's data is also significant in ways that go beyond its camera footage. Rideshare companies maintain trip data that is more detailed than what drivers typically see. The precise GPS coordinates of pickup and drop-off, time-stamped to the second, the route taken, the speed at each point along the route, whether the driver stopped anywhere unexpectedly, whether the vehicle paused in a location that was not the designated drop-off, whether there were any anomalies in the trip data that deviate from what a normal transit from one point to another would look like. That data is maintained by the rideshare company and can be obtained through legal process by federal investigators. Whether it has been obtained and what it shows is not publicly confirmed. What is certain is that it exists and that it covers the specific period in the specific geographic area where the most important movements in this case occurred. Beyond the specific vehicles connected to Nancy Guthrie's evening, there is the broader question of what vehicle the suspect used to flee the scene. This is the unknown that everything else in the investigation is trying to resolve. He arrived at her home somehow. He left with her somehow. He traveled from her home to wherever she was taken. That travel involved a vehicle, and that vehicle was on the roads of Tucson at some point in the early morning hours after the abduction. Every camera that was recording in the relevant corridor during the relevant window is a potential source of the footage that would show that vehicle. The investigation has been collecting footage since the beginning. Fresh federal review of that footage, with enhanced technological tools and eyes unclouded by 3 months of accumulated assumptions, is the current investigative strategy. If the vehicle is in any of that footage, the fresh review will find it. At the end of 3 months of investigation, the true crime analysis of the Nancy Guthrie case points to a consistent conclusion. The evidence exists. The question is whether it has been correctly identified and read. Every major forensic case that is eventually resolved has a moment that investigators can point to afterward and say, this was when we finally saw what had been in front of us the whole time. A piece of footage that had been reviewed and set aside until someone with fresh eyes recognized what was in it. A vehicle data record that had been extracted but not fully analyzed until a new investigator asked a different question of the same data. A witness who had provided information in the first days that was not recognized as significant until 3 months later, when new evidence created the context that made it meaningful. The Nancy Guthrie case has the elements for one of those moments. The route is mapped. The camera locations along it are identified. The vehicle data from multiple cars present that night exists and can be accessed. The hair evidence from inside the home is being processed. The footage from January 11 and from the night of January 30 is in investigators' hands. The description of the masked individual at the front door is on record. The behavioral profile of a suspect who came to that neighborhood multiple times before acting is documented. What the fresh federal review brings to all of that material is perspective. Investigators who are encountering the accumulated evidence for the first time, without the weight of 3 months of assumptions about which pieces matter most, approach it differently. They may ask why a specific piece of footage from a peripheral location was not pursued. They may note that the vehicle spotted 2.5 miles from the home, dismissed early in the investigation, falls precisely within the corridor that Annie Guthrie's route map identifies. They may extract data from a vehicle record that had been collected but not fully analyzed. The theory that this abduction was planned and executed with knowledge of Savannah Guthrie's profile, that Nancy Guthrie was targeted because of who her daughter is not contradicted by any piece of the physical evidence. It is consistent with the level of planning visible in the surveillance across multiple prior visits. A suspect who researched this family enough to identify Nancy Guthrie as a target is a suspect who left digital traces of that research. Federal investigators have tools for finding those traces that local law enforcement does not routinely apply. The fresh federal review is the application of those tools to this question. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She needs medication she does not have. Her heart is fragile. Her family describes every day as agony and every night as long. The neighbor who lives near her home is afraid that whoever did this is still in the area and still capable of choosing another target. The community has been living with the unresolved aftermath of this crime for 3 months, and it has not stopped being afraid or being attentive. That community attention, that sustained awareness, is itself an investigative resource. People who are paying attention notice things they would otherwise miss. A vehicle they do not recognize on a street where they know everyone's cars. A face that does not fit the neighborhood. A behavior pattern that is slightly off. And now, with a reward of more than $1 million in place for information leading to Nancy Guthrie's recovery, the financial incentive to report what you have noticed has never been higher. The true crime analytical conclusion from 3 months of accumulated information is this: the evidence in this case points somewhere. The route Annie Guthrie identified, the camera network along it, the vehicle data from the night of the abduction, the forensic material recovered from the home, the behavioral profile of a suspect who planned for weeks. All of it points in a direction. What the investigation needs is the specific piece of evidence or testimony that confirms where that direction leads. That confirmation may already be in the accumulated footage being reviewed by fresh federal eyes. It may come from a tip generated by the public release of the suspect description or the reward announcement. It may come from a laboratory result that connects the recovered hair to a known profile. But it will come. Cases built on physical evidence and the deliberate behavioral record of a suspect who left traces across multiple visits to a specific location do not remain permanently unresolved. They resolve when the right question is asked of the evidence that has been waiting to answer it. The route is there. The cameras are there. Nancy Guthrie's family is waiting at the end of it. true crime analysis of targeted abductions, specifically those where the victim is chosen because of their connection to someone with a public profile, produces a consistent pattern that is visible in the Nancy Guthrie case. The selection of Nancy Guthrie as a target involves a specific process. She is 84 years old, in fragile health, dependent on mobility assistance and on others for transportation. She lives in a residential area separate from the nationally known figure who is her daughter. She is, by any assessment of her physical circumstances, a person of significant vulnerability. The person who chose her either identified her vulnerability independently, which required knowing who she was and where she lived, or identified her because of her relationship to her daughter and then assessed her as the accessible point of vulnerability in that relationship. Either path to selection requires prior knowledge. Prior knowledge of this family's structure and of this specific woman's circumstances does not come from casual observation. It comes from research. Digital searches, review of publicly available family information, examination of the publicly accessible information about Savannah Guthrie's family background. That research is the pre-crime phase that precedes the surveillance phase. And research of this kind, conducted in digital spaces, leaves traces in the form of search records, browsing history, and the metadata of digital activity that federal investigators can access through appropriate legal process. The significance of identifying the victim selection process is that it points to the beginning of the crime's timeline, which is earlier than the first surveillance visit on January 11th. The crime began when someone decided that Nancy Guthrie was the target. Everything that followed, the research, the surveillance, the preparation, the execution, all flowed from that initial decision. Tracing the decision backward through the digital traces of the research that produced it is one of the investigative paths that fresh federal eyes with access to digital forensic tools are capable of pursuing. The scale of the financial commitment the family has made, the $1 million reward, is itself consistent with a targeted abduction that the family understands to be connected to Savannah Guthrie's public profile. Families who believe a crime was random do not necessarily commit resources at that level. Families who believe a crime was directed at them, at someone they love because of who the family is, respond with everything they have. The $1 million reward is an expression of that belief expressed in the most direct financial form available. The true crime community has in the past decade developed a relationship with active investigations that law enforcement does not always fully utilize, and that the analytical community does not always fully value. The Nancy Guthrie case represents a situation where the civilian dimension of investigation has been materially important. The Ring camera footage that captured a vehicle approximately 2.5 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home was not submitted by a law enforcement agency. It was submitted, presumably, by a civilian who had a camera system and who reviewed their footage in the context of a widely publicized missing persons case and found something they believed was relevant. That person submitted the footage to investigators. The investigators, at that stage of the investigation, assessed the footage and did not find it actionable. That assessment may have been influenced by the assumptions that were shaping the investigation at the time. It may have been influenced by the investigative priorities of that moment, which were focused on other leads. Whatever the reason for the assessment, the footage was set aside. When Annie Guthrie's route map is overlaid on the area, that vehicle sits within the corridor the map identifies. Two independent pieces of information, a civilian's camera footage and a family member's geographic knowledge, align in a way that the investigation did not initially treat as significant, but that fresh review may assess differently. This is how civilian contributions to investigations work. They do not always land in fertile investigative soil at the moment they are submitted. The value of a civilian contribution is sometimes not visible until other evidence provides the context that makes it meaningful. The vehicle on the Ring camera was not obviously relevant until Annie Guthrie's route map placed it in a geographic context that made its location more than coincidental. The fresh federal review of accumulated evidence by investigators who did not make the original assessment of that footage creates the opportunity for that recontextualization. Whether it produces a different assessment of the vehicle's relevance is not publicly confirmed. But the investigative logic of applying fresh eyes to a dismissed civilian tip in light of subsequent evidence that makes it more relevant is exactly what fresh review is designed to accomplish.